and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to take a deep dive into something I think you're going to find super interesting. We're talking about the long-term impacts of China's one-child policy.
Okay.
Specifically, we're focusing on, how it kind of shook things up in terms of the balance of men and women in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
So we've got some really cool research.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff.
It gets into some pretty heavy topics like missing women, the marriage squeeze.
Yeah.
And even how this could potentially destabilize society.
Absolutely.
So kind of a big deal.
Yeah. You ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're taking a look at China's one-child policy. A policy that, well, it did a lot more than just limit families,
It really did. It really set off this chain reaction demographically that we're still feeling the effects of today.
And we've got some really interesting sources to dive into today that should help us understand how this policy, from when it started back in 1980 all the way to when it ended in 2015, really reshaped China's population.
Yeah, it's a story that goes, it goes way beyond just simple birth rates. We're going to be looking at how this policy, combined with really deep cultural norms, created this kind of a demographic ripple effect.
Right.
Yeah, and it's impacting, well, everything, really, from their economy to their social fabric to even, I think, how they stand globally.
Yeah, I think that's right. And right off the bat, thinking of the one-child policy, it's important to note that it wasn't always, a hard and fast rule. There were definitely some exceptions to the policy, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. For example, ethnic minorities, they were allowed to have larger families. And rural families, sometimes, if their firstborn was a girl, they could have a second.
Okay.
Yeah. And even in some urban areas, some families, they could pay a fee. They called it a social maintenance fee, and they could have more kids.
Interesting. So it's kind of a policy with these built-in economic disparities,
Yeah.
But even with those variations, there's another layer to think about here, right?
Uh-huh.
We have to consider China's traditional preference for sons. How did that factor into the policy's impact, do you think?
Well, it really, it acted as a multiplier in a way.
Right.
Yeah, the preference for sons, it stems from their traditional roles, carrying on the family name, taking care of their parents as they get older, especially, in a society where there wasn't really a comprehensive social security net back then, and so that became, with these restrictions in place because of the policy, it really just became even more pronounced. And, this resulted in more, kind of uneven sex ratios. More so than what we probably would have seen otherwise.
Yeah. And we actually have, we have a map here, and it's color-coded to show the ratio of men to women who were born during the time of this one-child policy.
Yeah.
And you can really see this point kind of come to life. There are some regions, particularly in the Southeast, those big manufacturing hubs. It's just a sea of blue on this map. It indicates a huge surplus of men.
Yeah, and it's, looking at it, it's really striking. In some places like Dongguan, the ratio is, it's over 130 men for every 100 women.
Wow.
Yeah. And part of that is because those coastal areas, they attract, a lot of young men who are looking for work.
Yeah.
So that further skews the ratios. But then, you look closer at this map and you see this like surprising pink spot, Chizhou in Anhui province.
Yeah, and that's an area with fewer men than women.
Right.
Huh. That's interesting. That's a real anomaly. What could explain something like that?
Well, it really shows just how complex demographics can be, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be. It could be due to local policies, maybe.
Okay.
Or unique migration patterns, Maybe more men are leaving the area.
Right.
Or even some historical factor we're not thinking of, something that predates the policy.
Oh, interesting.
But, I mean, it really does show that, we can see these broad trends, right? But when you dig down, the reasons behind them are, well, they can be really localized.
Yeah, it's a good point. We can't just look, big picture all the time. We have to zoom in and think about those unique factors at play in different areas. But let's zoom back out for a second, and talk about this term, this chilling term, missing women. Demographers estimate that there are over 30 million missing women in China. And I think a lot of people hear that and they think, what does that even mean?
Right.
What does that actually mean?
Well, it's a way to quantify this gender imbalance,
Okay.
And what it means is that, there are far fewer women in China than there should be.
Okay.
Naturally. If you look at typical birth ratio.
Like it's not about women like literally disappearing.
Right.
It's more about
it's more about a combination of things, really.
Okay.
Sex-selective abortion, underreporting female births to avoid, penalties, and sadly, in some cases, infanticide.
Wow.
And this all comes back to, the pressure to have sons and the policy. Well, it just amplified it.
Yeah, and that leads right into this thing called what they call the marriage squeeze, right? I mean, if you have, millions more men than women, there just aren't enough brides to go around. So what are some of the consequences we see, societally from an imbalance like that?
Well, you see a lot of things. Well, we see more bride trafficking, forced marriages, things like that.
Right.
Because, the demand is higher than the supply. And bride prices, they're becoming more and more common, where families have to pay huge amounts of money to try to, secure a wife for their son. And this is especially bad in rural areas where, well, the competition is just fierce.
Yeah. And then there's this term that Chinese sociologists use to describe these unmarried men without descendants, and they call them bare branches. And it's almost poetic, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But there's this, there's a pretty bleak undertone there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you think of these men who are just, cut off from that traditional family lineage. And it's not just personal, it's a tragedy for these men, of course.
Sure.
But it does raise concerns about, what it means for society as a whole. Some research has shown that, when you have a lot of these bare branches, it could, potentially lead to more mental health issues,
Yeah.
Maybe higher crime rates, even social unrest. I mean, it's not for sure, but
It's something to think about. It's almost like this, this demographic time bomb, right?
yeah.
Ticking away for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just now starting to see it go off, And then on top of the bare branches, there's this other thing called the 4-2-1 problem. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the 4-2-1 problem, it's basically, well, it describes this massive burden that's placed on single children who were, born under the one-child policy. So you have one child, and often it's a son.
Okay.
And they could be potentially responsible for 4 grandparents and 2 parents.
Wow. So 6 elders, all depending on one person.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Especially, we know that China's population, well, it's aging rapidly.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're already seeing this burden, on the younger generation and how it affects them. It impacts whether they even want to have bigger families or if they can afford it. I mean, they're caught between taking care of older relatives and just, trying to raise their own kids in a place where the cost of living is so high.
Yeah, it really paints a picture of the unintended consequences of a policy like this.
Yeah.
And it seems like, eventually the Chinese government kind of recognized, like, hey, maybe this is going to create a demographic crisis.
Yeah.
And they did eventually shift away from the one-child policy, right?
They did, yeah. In 2016, they moved to a two-child policy.
Okay.
And later they even, allowed families to have up to 3 children.
So they kind of reverse course a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's not, it's not as easy as just reversing, think about it. After decades, the impact of that policy, it's pretty ingrained at this point.
So even with these policy changes, it's not like things just went back to how they were before.
No, not really. Fertility rates, they've stayed low.
Hmm.
It's not really about, it's not just about how many children people are allowed to have anymore. It's about how many they want to have,
Right.
And after decades of, high living costs and social norms are changing, and people, well, they just want smaller families now.
It's like the one-child policy created this like cultural momentum, right? It's hard to stop.
Exactly. And, we are seeing urban families, especially educated families. They're, starting to view daughters, sons,
Okay.
more equally now.
Sure.
But those decades of the policy, they really left a mark.
So even if things do eventually even out, which they haven't yet.
Mm-hmm. Right. This generation that was born under the one-child policy, they're going to be dealing with the effects of the gender imbalance for a long time.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, this long-term momentum. It's gonna play out, in how they find partners, in their jobs, in elder care. It's part of their society now.
It's really incredible. It's incredible to me how something that, seems like a straightforward policy can have such, it's just wild how big the consequences are, how long they last. And we've just scratched the surface here. This demographic earthquake, it's shaking up, everything from their housing market to their rural communities.
Exactly. Yeah. and we've seen how it's affected, families and individuals. But the next part of this, this deep dive, we're going to be looking at the bigger picture.
Okay.
The societal and economic aftershocks. Sounds good. Stay with us as we keep going down this rabbit hole. So we've been really digging into the impact of China's one-child policy, those skewed gender ratios, the missing women. We've talked about the bare branches and that 4-2-1 problem. And it's pretty clear this policy, it did way more than just limit family size.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. And as we kind of go further in this, in this deep dive, we're going to see just how much, these changes, these demographic shifts have kind of impacted, China's entire economy and society.
It's interesting to me to think about how a policy that, that was meant to control how fast the population was growing could end up having an impact on something like, their housing market. What's the connection there?
Well, let's think back to those millions of unmarried men, especially in the cities, in China, owning a home. It's seen as, it's almost like you need it to get married.
Right.
It shows, that you're stable, that you're doing okay financially.
So when you have all these men and they're all trying to find, a wife, and there just aren't that many women, owning a home becomes even more important.
Exactly. Yeah. More men want homes, but there aren't enough to go around. So what happens? Well, the prices go way up. And we've seen that in a lot of Chinese cities. And that creates, this whole other problem, economically. It's hard for these young people. They want to get married, they want to have families, but they can't even afford it.
It's almost like even though the policy's gone,
right,
it's still like holding them back.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
And speaking of, kind of being held back, let's talk about this thing they call it rural hollowing. What exactly is that? Okay,
so rural hollowing, that's basically when you have young people, and it's mostly young men, and they leave the rural areas, the villages,
right,
and they go to the cities, to find work, to try to make a better life. But when they do that, it leaves, mostly older people in the countryside.
And we know that, we know those cities tend to have more men because of, people moving there.
Right.
So it kind of makes things worse in those rural areas.
Yeah, it does. It creates this kind of, I guess you could call it a cycle. You have fewer young people, so you have less, stuff happening economically, fewer businesses, things like that. You have fewer women who could have children. And, well, that just leads to even lower birth rates in those areas. These villages, they're becoming empty. Not literally, but
right,
in terms of people and, their economy.
It's sad. And, we were talking about the 4-2-1 problem before.
Yeah.
All these young people leaving, It must put a huge strain on, places that take care of older folks and the healthcare system, especially in those rural areas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when all the young people go to the cities, there's no one left to take care of their parents and grandparents.
Right.
And China's,
Yeah.
they're working on it, but their safety net, for people, it's not really there yet.
Yeah.
So the burden, it falls on those single children. And a lot of times they're just not ready for that. They're not equipped to handle it.
It's tough to imagine, right?
It is,
These
yeah.
people that are trying to take care of their own families,
Mm-hmm.
and then they have, 6 other people who need help. I mean, it really shows how much this policy, it's still affecting them.
Yeah, it does. It underscores the fact that, even if a policy has good intentions, it can have consequences that no one saw coming.
Right. And it's not just families,
Yeah.
or individuals who are affected.
Yeah.
It's like this whole chain of events,
Yeah.
and they're still shaping China's economy and society.
Exactly. It's a big, complicated story.
It is. And so far, it's been kind of a gloomy picture.
Yeah.
But are there any signs of hope? I mean, what is China doing to try to, fix some of these long-term problems?
Well, there are some positive things.
Okay.
They did switch to a 2-child policy, then 3.
Right.
So they know, they recognize that there's a problem.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing local governments, they're trying different things to encourage people to have more kids.
Like what kind of things are they doing?
Well, they're giving out, money, like allowances for families.
Yeah.
They're helping with housing costs, giving people longer maternity and paternity leave, things like that, just to try and make it easier, financially to have kids.
It seems like they're just trying a lot of things to see what works.
Yeah, it's a lot of trial and error, but, it's hard. It's hard to change how people think about things, especially when they've been thinking a certain way for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For so long, the message was, 1 child is enough. And now it's like they're saying the opposite.
Right. And that's a big shift culturally,
It is. But are there, you said there were some positive things, some trends.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Well, a lot of women, especially in the cities, women who have, good jobs, they're waiting longer to get married and have kids. Or they're choosing to have smaller families because they want,
Right.
And that's a good it means women have more control over their lives
Yeah, that's a good point.
and how many children they have. And, you're also seeing, especially with younger people, they're starting to move away from that idea that you need a son, to make sure your family is taken care of. So that could maybe, take some of the pressure off for people to have boys.
Maybe those old cultural ideas, the ones that really, made the policy's impacts so much worse, maybe they're starting to fade a bit.
Maybe. It's possible. But, demographics, they change slowly. It takes time. Even if we keep seeing these trends, it's going to take, it could take generations for things to really balance out after the 1-child policy.
It's crazy how long something like that can affect a country.
Yeah.
It's a good lesson for other countries, though.
Right.
Especially in East and South Asia, they're facing, similar problems.
Yeah, China's story. It's definitely something to learn from, when you're thinking about trying to control your population.
Yeah, it's a reminder that you have to think about the long term.
Absolutely.
Not just about the numbers, but about how it's going to affect people. For generations, and that there are going to be consequences that you didn't even think about.
Exactly. And, in China, that son preference, it really made things worse, with the gender ratio. So it shows that, it's not just policy, it's also culture.
Right.
And they kind of work together,
Yeah.
But, it also shows that, demographics, they're important, but they're not. They're adaptable.
Yeah.
They can figure things out, even when things are really tough.
That's true. So we've looked at the past, we've looked at what's happening now, but what about the future? What do you think? What are some things that could happen as China tries to, deal with all this?
Well, that's a tough question.
It is, yeah.
There are a lot of things that could happen, but let's talk about some of the things we don't know yet,
Okay.
and maybe some of the possibilities for China in the last part of this deep dive.
So we've talked about the impact of this 1-child policy,
Yeah.
and those really personal stories, like the bare branches and the 421 problem and those bigger societal and, economic problems it's caused, the housing market, what's happening in rural communities. And now I think it's time to, to look ahead a little bit. What's in store for China? I mean, how are they going to deal with all this?
Oh, trying to predict the future is
It's tricky, especially with, a country like China. It's huge. It's always changing. But I mean, I think if we look at, what we've talked about, the trends, I think we can start to see some possibilities.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Let's start with the with the gender imbalance. I mean, it's been a problem for a long time. Is there any way that those ratios can even out? It's going to be tough.
Yeah.
Even with the policy changes and, them trying to encourage people to have more kids, that generation, the one that, grew up with the one-child policy, it's going to have an impact for a long time. But demographics, I mean, they're not fixed,
Right.
People move, they adapt, they make different choices based on what's happening around them.
So maybe we'll see, new ways of doing things socially, as people try to figure this out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for example, those bride prices we were talking about.
Right.
They've gotten so high, families have to pay so much. It's possible that it just becomes like too much, and maybe that forces people to, to change what they expect, or maybe we'll see, more marriages between people from different regions.
Right.
Men from areas where there are a lot of men, maybe they'll start looking for partners in other provinces or even, other countries.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about,
Yeah.
like how something like this, like just not enough women could change like the culture, like how people act.
Yeah.
And what about the economic side of things? I mean, people are worried about, being able to take care of their parents as they get older.
Yeah.
Could that keep the birth rates down? Or are there solutions for that?
That's a big question. But, China, they're ahead of the game when it comes to technology, like robotics, artificial intelligence, all that.
Yeah.
So, it's not crazy to think that, maybe they'll start using those things to, to help take care of older people.
Oh, wow.
Which could, that could take some of the pressure off of families.
It's like something out of a movie, right? Robots taking care of our parents. It's definitely something to think about. This has been, this deep dive it's been really interesting, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
I think that's true. Yeah. We've covered a lot. But China's story, it's still being written. The one-child policy, it really changed the country, And what happens next? Well, it's going to be shaped by by what's happened. But I think this is bigger than just China,
Right. What can other countries learn from this?
Well, I think the big thing is you have to think about the long term, when it comes to any policy, really.
Yeah.
Especially something like this. It's not just about, keeping the numbers down. It's about how it's going to, it's going to ripple out.
Yeah.
It's going to affect people for generations. And there might be, there are probably going to be things that happen that, that no one even thought about.
Yeah. It's like you can't just make a policy and not think about like how it's going to fit in with everything else that's going on.
Yeah. China's, their preference for sons, that made the gender ratios even worse. Right.
It shows that, like it's not just policy, it's culture too.
Yeah.
It's how they, they work together, But it also shows that, demographics, they're powerful, but they're not, they're adaptable.
Yeah, they find a way.
Yeah, they figure things out.
So we've talked about China, what they did, what's happening now, and what might happen. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important for all of you listening to, to keep thinking about this.
Yeah.
What really stuck with you? What questions do you still have? Share your thoughts. Let's keep talking about this. It's a really important story, and who knows what the future holds. But one thing's for sure, China's story. It's going to keep fascinating us, I think, and we're going to learn a lot from it.
Yeah.
For a long time to come.